Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, when you think about cloud technology and data centers, what do you think of? What do you know about this industry and what is happening behind the scenes? Well, today I've invited CyrusOne EVP Managing Director Matthew Pullen onto the podcast. And for those of you that are not aware, CyrusOne specialises in enterprise data centre co-location services with nearly 50 data centres across the US, Europe and Asia. But today I want to take a peek behind the curtain and have a look what the data centre of the future might look like, and also how the increased regulation and legislation will impact the industry. And finally, talk about sustainability in the industry, the rise of green tech and founding of the Climate Neutral Data Centre Pact. We've got a lot to get through today, so buckle up and hold on tight so I can beam your ears all the way to the UK, where Matthew is not only waiting to share his story and the story behind the company, CyrusOne, we will also explore the future of data centres and what that might look like. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Sure. And Neil, thanks very much for having me on your show. Yeah, so my name's Matthew Pullen. I'm one of the executive vice presidents at CyrusOne, and I'm also the managing director of CyrusOne's business in Europe.
Fantastic. And I always like to learn a little bit more about my guests. So my question to you is, how did you get here? What's your origin story? Because there's always a story that puts you on the path where you are now, right?
I started my professional career in real estate services. So I did a real estate degree at university, and then I joined one of the big real estate services companies that's now branded CBRE. And this was back in 1990. And I was obviously young and keen. And so for the first 2 years of my career, I did, the standard rotation to be able to then qualify as a chartered surveyor. Highly inspiring, just like my dad. And it was then interesting because back in the early 90s, what started to happen was that quite a few of the global companies looked to sort of outsource a lot of their property work to, either single or a small group of real estate services firms. And the first company that engaged with what was Richard Ellis then was AT&T. Mm. And I was asked if I'd help out with the account. And so I said yes, because it was quite interesting because it meant that I got to do work across Europe as opposed to just in London. And the good thing about AT&T was that they sent everybody associated with them from a professional perspective on training courses. So I went off to New Jersey quite frequently and learned about things like how the telephone works, how a 5E switch works, all those wonderful things. And that just made me a little bit dangerous because I actually understood what was behind a few buzzwords. So it gave the impression that I knew an awful lot about telecoms and telecoms networks when I only knew a fraction, really. Yeah. But what that meant was then when the telco boom took off in the late 90s, when all the big US telecoms companies decided to roll out their networks globally, I was a kind of go-to person for those companies because it seemed that I knew something. So what I did is formed a team within Richard Ellis, a data center team. And that team had a prolific amount of work during the telco boom, helping with the sort of real estate side of the telecoms network deployment. So landing stations in Cornwall, repeater sites up the A303, and then little data centers, points of presence in major cities across Europe, which then led to sort of bigger data centers, co-location style facilities. It was really that exposure to the telco boom that really meant that I became quite well versed in data centers, and I was able to sort of recycle that experience then through the enterprise data center market, and where I am now, trying trying to hold the tiger by the tail in this hyperscale phase of the data center market.
Wow, what a great story. And of course, it was that path that led you to CyrusOne, which specializes in enterprise data center co-location services. And I think you've got something like nearly 50 data centers across the US, Europe, and Asia. But for people that are listening and hearing about you for the first time, can you possibly set the scene and tell the listeners a little bit more about the kind of problems that you solve for businesses with your tech?
I'll focus on the hyperscale period that we're in. So, people think about the cloud and think that maybe it's up in the sky somewhere. And the reality is that the cloud sits in buildings, buildings that provide the right environments for servers to process and store data. It's as simple as that. So we provide facilities for major cloud companies. We also provide facilities for large enterprise customers who won't necessarily want to put all of their applications and all of their business into the cloud, want to maintain an element of what's called sort of on-prem data center. So it's great. We have a really, really rich mix of customers ranging, as I said, from the big cloud companies all the way through to the larger enterprise customers. Generally, the data centers are in urban or suburban environments. As you say, we've got over 50 in Europe. We've got 12 facilities, but we're on a rapid growth path. Really, as I mentioned earlier, the analogy of holding the tiger by the tail, the industry is growing at a phenomenal rate across the world, with probably the higher growth rate being in Europe right now and in Asia to some degree, just as it catches up with the trends that have been set in North America.
And so much has changed in the world in the last 2 years alone. But it's also an argument that how we define work and data centers in particular is completely different from a decade ago. So can you tell me a bit more about how you see the data center of now looks and what the future for data centers look like? Because again, if we go back 10 years ago, it was completely different, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, if we go back 5 years ago, it was completely different. If you think 5 years ago, a huge data center would have been defined as a 10 megawatt data center. To put, and sorry to use this megawatt term, but if you think that for each megawatt, you need a footprint of roughly 5,000 square feet of raised floor, and the raised floor component of any building requires the same amount of ancillary space again. So each megawatt's about 10,000 square feet in total. So 10 megawatts would be 100,000 square feet. And that's a reasonably sized shed. So about 2.5 acres. Today, a 10 megawatt data center is regarded as tiny. We're trending towards 30 to 40 megawatt data centers being the norm, and then in campuses that would probably, break through 100 megawatts of IT load. So it's just the scale that's become so phenomenal. The only thing I would say is that, in the past, data centers weren't necessarily so visible because so many data centers were actually within the office buildings and other types of buildings of the enterprise companies. So you wouldn't necessarily have been aware of the aggregation of data center footprint. But what's happening, and we'll hopefully touch on it in our discussion, with the industry now having its head above the parapet, with therefore a lot of pressure on making sure that data centers are friendly to the planet. What you're seeing is that a lot of the on-premises data centers that were in office buildings are effectively coming out of those buildings as the enterprise companies outsource to the cloud, and all that activity is then being aggregated in these much, much larger data centers, which are becoming incredibly efficient and far more friendly to the planet.
Yeah, and I am looking forward to diving a little bit deeper into the subject of green tech, particularly around data centers in a moment. But before we do, how do you stand on where do you stand on the increased regulation and legislation impact? And how do you see that impacting the future of data centers too? Because it's a big deal, not only here in the UK, but obviously in the US and all over the world right now. And there seems to be more and more talk about it, especially in these uncertain times where certain countries are getting more guarded on where that data is able to be accessed from.
Yeah, totally. And I've witnessed it firsthand. So my journey to CyrusOne involved being part of a company called Xenium, which was a startup data center business that we established in 2012, 2013. And we built data centers in Turkey, in Germany, in the UK. And that business then became the sort of the European platform for Cyrus when they bought it in 2018. And it was interesting because when we sold the Xenium business to Cyrus, it was just after the Germans had really introduced the first piece of legislation around sort of the national security issue. So in Germany, any data center that's over 5 megawatts is considered to be critical national infrastructure, and therefore the government have the ability to buy in businesses that are offered for sale, or veto potential sale to unfriendlies, or support the sale. In our case, the German government supported the sale, but it took them 9 months to get their heads around the proposed transaction, because the new legislation was so new and because data centers themselves are relatively new, and a concept which the German government departments didn't really understand initially. So the sort of legislation we saw in Germany, interestingly, has just been introduced in the UK. And I'm thankful that, you probably know, we're in the process of taking CyrusOne from being a public company to a private company. And again, that process needed regulatory approval. The UK government has been very supportive of the transaction. So, that's the sort of legislation around national security and sort of all as well drives from data sovereignty issues, etc. We're then seeing more regulation coming in to ensure that, as I mentioned earlier, that data centers are on the path to being more climate friendly.
And on that climate friendly front, there is such a big focus on sustainability in the tech industry right now, and the founding of the Climate Neutral Data Center Pact as well. But can you expand on that and what it means for the future of the industry and the kind of part that you're playing in that too?
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to. The Climate Neutral Data Center Pact is a really important step. So there's over 100 signatories to the pact, and those signatories are generally the large cloud companies, the data center operators like ourselves, and also the national trade associations, the data center national trade associations. And the purpose of the pact, and we were one of the founding members and initial signatories, is to try and get ahead of potential legislation. Now, the issue, and I kind of highlighted it when I talked about national security issues, is that because the industry is quite young and data centers are not really well understood, and there's also been some sort of negative public comment in certain countries about data centers, with some quite sensationalist views around the amount of energy they might be consuming and will consume in the future. That the industry wanted to ensure that we had a very sensible dialogue with Brussels as it related to emerging legislation. Europe is obviously very keen to be climate neutral by 2050, and as part of that drive, Europe would like data centers to be climate neutral by 2030. So what we wanted to do is be proactive and go to Brussels with our ideas as to how we could self-regulate the industry to make sure that data centers were climate neutral by 2030. We've been running for some time over 12 months. We've got together quite a lot of proposals, particularly around water and particularly around energy. The members are in the process of voting on what we think we should propose to Brussels in terms of those metrics and what we should have as our targets for 2025 and then 2030 to ensure climate neutrality.
And I think if anyone listening is thinking about the world of data centers and the technology behind it, I suspect that many people would not be thinking about sustainability, regulation and legislation and all that stuff. But I'm curious, if you were to look into your virtual crystal ball, what predictions would you make across the broader industry for the future? Because there seems to be a lot going on there at the moment.
Yeah, so I think at the moment we're combating, as I said earlier, we're combating some interesting public sentiment issues. There is this misconception that data centers are consuming the world's energy and potentially consuming all the water on the planet as well, which isn't the case. In fact, when you look at the UK, for example, the transportation sector accounts for approximately 20% of energy consumption. Data centers account for roughly 2% of energy and about 1% of electricity. And that hasn't changed a great deal over the last few years, even though the industry has grown exponentially. And it goes back to the comments I made earlier, which is that what's happening is that these smaller, highly inefficient data centers are being closed down and replaced with large, extremely efficient cloud scale data centers. So my prediction is that those data centers are going to continue to grow in scale, as I've mentioned, but they're also going to continue to improve from an efficiency point of view. And in particular, what we're all expecting is that the operating temperatures within data centers will be able to rise as technology advances, server technology advances, meaning that there won't be so much electricity required to cool the facilities. And there'll also be a lot more evolution in terms of design as to what to do with the waste heat, particularly around providing heat from municipal, residential or commercial heating systems, and also helping in agricultural processes as well. So I think you're just going to see data centers becoming far more efficient and more symbiotic with the environment.
And what's next for CyrusOne? I appreciate you probably can't share too much, but are there any teasers you could possibly leave us with about your plans for the future?
The going private is really, really, really exciting. Yeah. The issue we had as a public company was that in order to maintain our investment grade status, which is the way in which you access the most cost effective capital, it meant that we had to keep our leverage ratios pretty tight, which meant ultimately we only had access to a certain amount of capital. And as I've said a number of times, the industry is growing so fast, and with the momentum that we have across the world, we needed to become private to access the capital that is so interested in our sector. So what you'll see is that we will grow at a significantly increased rate as a private company versus a public company. Our strategy is pretty clear, which is that we want to achieve significant scale in the key digital gateway markets of the world. So in Europe, that's places like London and Frankfurt. But it's interesting how the whole industry is spreading across the world. So, markets that might not have been considered key gateway markets a couple of years ago are emerging very rapidly, the likes of, Madrid and Milan and Zurich and other places. So you'll see us growing at scale in the major markets, and then you'll see us emerging in distributed markets, more and more markets as the digital economy spreads across the world.
Well, I've loved chatting with you today. So much gold in everything that we've spoken about. But before I let you go, I always like to ask my guests to leave the listeners with a personal touch of inspiration by sharing either a book that has inspired them, or maybe a go-to song that they need to get their head in the zone, or a song that's important to them. But the big question for you is, what are you going to leave everyone listening with today? And is there a story to accompany your choice?
I apologise, because what I wanted to share is more around a point that's come to the fore through experience. And it's been really tough for the industry during the pandemic, to be honest, I'm privileged to be in an industry that's been growing during the pandemic, and I do have a great deal of empathy for people in industries that suffered so badly during the pandemic. But it was very hard for the industry during the pandemic to keep pace with the growth, and you can understand that the growth was accelerated. I mean, us doing what we're doing now on Zoom is just one of the manifestations of what the pandemic has done in terms of the digital economy. And what's also happened in our industry is that demand has aggregated in a few very, very, very large buyers of our product. And I think what has become so key, I'm the sort of person who is very relationship orientated. I love people. I'm inspired by my colleagues and customers. And I think the hardest thing to accept during the pandemic was that, you had to pivot away from being solely focused on relationships to ensure that in a rapid growth industry that you've absolutely got the right talent in the key jobs to enable the industry to keep pace and to keep delivering. And I think that was one of the hardest things that I found. And it's always been there through experience, but in times of adversity, you've always got to ensure that you're making the right decisions about people in roles and looking beyond just your relationship mindset. And that was pretty hard.
So powerful, the words you've said there, and I think it'll resonate with everyone listening all over the world. I think it's something that everybody has felt and experienced. And for anyone listening, just wanting to find out more information about CyrusOne and the work that you're doing, keeping up to speed with everything that's going on, and it's going to be a very big year for you for obvious reasons. What's the best starting point?
It's pretty simple. It's www.cyrusone.com, where you'll find a lot of rich information around the company, and all of the information that we're putting out there, whether it be through podcasts such as this or whether it be through white papers, etc. Particularly people who I think are intrigued by the industry because it's new to them. Yeah. It would be a good place to go to just understand a little bit more about data centers and what data centers support.
Absolutely. And a few things that stood out for me when looking at that data center of the future is the increased regulation and legislation, but also this sustainability in the industry. And obviously the founding of the climate neutral data center pack is going to make a huge difference as well. But more than anything, just thank you for taking the time to share all that with us today, Matthew.
Oh, you're welcome, Nick. Thanks again for having me.
It really does sound like an exciting time for the team at CyrusOne. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about everything that we talked about today, from that data center of the future to predictions across the broader industry and sustainability, green tech, regulation, legislation. We did cover a lot in a short amount of time, and I know this is a topic that will be very close to your heart wherever you're listening in the world. And you've probably got a different set of experiences, expectations, insights, and I want to get those voices onto this podcast too, as well as any questions that you might have. So email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn at Neil C. Hughes. And my website is techblogwriter.co.uk. And remember, if you leave a rating and review of the podcast wherever you listen, send me a screenshot and I'll give you a shout out on a future episode too. But that's it for today. We're out of time already, but I'll return again tomorrow. But a big thank you for listening. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.